January 1981, San Francisco, the West Coast Computer Fair. Between tables of hobbyist kits and beige boxes, a Bangkok-born computer book publisher named Adam Osborne wheels out something that looks less like a computer and more like a sewing machine case with a handle. He opens the lid and a 5-inch screen glows to life between two floppy disk drives. There's no battery inside, it runs only from a wall socket. Yet Osborne calls it portable and dares anyone in the room to argue. Nobody watching quite grasps what they're looking at, and nobody could have guessed that within about 18 months, this box would turn its inventor's company into one of the fastest growing hardware businesses Silicon Valley had yet produced, or that within about 18 months after that, the company would be bankrupt. The irony that would define the Osborne Computer Corporation was already sitting inside that case. A man who taught the world what portable computing looked like built a company that could do almost anything at speed except survive its own success. If you're old enough to have used one, you remember the weight before you remember anything else. Close to 25 pounds of steel and plastic, more suitcase than laptop, with a handle that dug into your palm on the walk from the car. You remember setting it on a desk, unlatching it, watching the keyboard fold down to double as a lid. You remember the screen, a 5-inch porthole of green or amber text, 52 characters wide and 24 lines tall, read from about a foot away, because that's as close as you could get it. You remember the twin floppy drives clicking and whirring as they loaded CP/M, the operating system that was. For one brief window in the early 80s, the closest thing personal computing had to a universal standard. You remember that the case came with almost everything you needed already inside it: a word processor, a spreadsheet, a couple of flavors of BASIC, worth nearly as much as the hardware itself, so that buying an Osborne felt less like buying a computer and more like buying an office. And you remember that, for all the talk of portability, there was no battery. Portable meant you could carry it to a wall outlet, not away from one. It was heavy, small-screened, and tethered by its own power cord. And for a little while, it was still the most exciting thing in computing, because it was the first machine that let an ordinary professional close a briefcase around their entire working life. Adam Osborne had not set out to build computers. Trained as a chemical engineer with a bachelor's degree from the University of Birmingham and a doctorate from the University of Delaware, he spent much of the 1970s in the Bay Area writing plain English manuals that explained the strange new microcomputers everyone else was struggling to understand. His publishing venture did well enough that he sold it to McGraw-Hill in 1979. But Osborne carried a second conviction, one he'd later summarize in 5 words. Adequacy is sufficient, everything else is irrelevant. Most people, he believed, didn't need the fastest or most powerful machine on the market. They needed one that was cheap, complete out of the box, and rugged enough to survive being checked as luggage. In 1980, he founded the Osborne Computer Corporation and brought in Lee Felsenstein, a respected engineer from the Bay Area's homebrew computer club circle, to design the hardware, drawing loosely on an unreleased Xerox PARC prototype known as the Note Taker. The result, unveiled at the West Coast Computer Fair in January 1981 and released that April, at $1,795, was the Osborne one. 24.5 pounds, built around a Zilog Z80 processor and 64 kilobytes of memory, wrapped around that cramped 5-inch display, and bundled with roughly $1,500 worth of included software. It worked spectacularly. Osborne Computer grew from Osborne and Felsenstein as its only 2 employees to a payroll of roughly 3,000 within about a year. Annual revenue climbed from under $6 million in 1981 to somewhere around $70 million in 1982. And by the summer of 1982, the company's sales pace was running at an annualized rate past $100 million. A growth curve that, at the time, few microcomputer companies had ever matched. At its peak, the company was manufacturing 10,000 Osborne ones a month, and lifetime sales of the machine would eventually run well past 100,000 units, with some tallies putting the total closer to 150,000 or 200,000 once European sales are included. The growth outran the org's chart almost comically. One Osborne executive, returning from a single week away at a trade show, reportedly had to search 2 different buildings before she located her own relocated staff. In October 1982, the company temporarily bundled in a copy of Ashton Tate's debased two-database software to push demand even higher, driving production to 500 units a day and, by multiple accounts, badly straining quality control on top of problems that had dogged the product since its earliest production runs, when failure rates reportedly ran as high as 10 to 15%. By late 1982, Osborne Computer Corporation looked from the outside like one of the most improbable success stories in American technology. A 2-year-old company with a new headquarters in Hayward, California, and what appeared to be a clear next step, taking itself public. Ask most people why Osborne collapsed, and you'll hear the same story: the Osborne Effect. In the months leading into 1983, with the Osborne One still selling briskly, Adam Osborne began talking publicly about the machines his company had coming next. A more powerful executive with a bigger screen and more memory, and eventually a cheaper Vixen. Both were still months from actually shipping. Dealers and customers did the obvious thing. They stopped buying the current model and waited for the better one. Osborne cut the Osborne One's price, first to $1,295, then as low as $995. It didn't restore demand. By the account of the trade press at the time, the company had essentially no incoming revenue in April and May of 1983. The exact months the executive was finally reaching the market at $2,495. The term Osborne Effect was coined from this sequence, and it has survived for more than 4 decades as a stock warning in business and product circles. Never talk about a product before you can ship it, or you'll cannibalize sales of the one you're currently making. This is true, it happened, it hurt, and it remains sound advice. But treated as the whole explanation, it doesn't hold up because plenty of companies have pre-announced products, taken a sales hit, and lived to tell about it. What the Osborne Effect explains is why demand paused for a season. It does not explain why a company that had just posted roughly $70 million in annual revenue couldn't survive a pause. To find the real cause, it helps to notice something the popular story usually skips. Osborne's growth had already stalled before the famous premature announcement even landed. Contemporary business reporting describes the company's expansion coming to an abrupt halt in the latter part of 1982, months before the executive shipped, and ties part of that stall to Osborne's slow, halting entry into the IBM-compatible clone market that had exploded after the 1981 launch of the IBM PC. But it wasn't simply a story of betting on the wrong operating system. A rival named Kaypro launched its own CP/M-based luggable, the Kaypro 2, in 1982, at the identical $1,795 price, with a 9-inch screen nearly double the size of Osborne's, and rode it to become, briefly, the 5th largest computer maker in the world. A company running the exact same operating system at the exact same price was growing while Osborne collapsed. Whatever was wrong at Osborne, it wasn't simply the choice of platform. What Osborne actually lacked was the internal machinery to survive its own scale. And the gaps show up everywhere you look. The accounting was a documented mess. Multiple contemporary accounts describe Osborne's bookkeeping as poor enough that, as early as September 1981, Bank of America had already declined to extend the company a line of credit over it. A company scaling this fast needs, almost more than anything else, an accurate real-time picture of its own cash and its own inventory. Osborne, by most tellings, didn't have one. In his own memoir, Osborne would later illustrate the rot with a specific, almost absurd figure of his own. Company executives, he wrote, spent roughly $2 million trying to salvage about $150,000 worth of old motherboards that had simply been sitting, forgotten in a warehouse. That is not a marketing misstep. That is a company that had lost track of its own materials and its own money. Layered on top of that was a leadership structure in open conflict at precisely the wrong moment. In early 1983, hoping to bring outside big company discipline to an operation still largely run on its founder's instincts, Osborne hired Robert Johnich, an executive from the packaged goods giant Consolidated Foods, as the company's new president and CEO. The partnership did not go smoothly. By multiple accounts, Jonick and Osborne clashed over strategy almost immediately. Jonick leaning toward a conventional, hardware-first approach, while Osborne continued to insist that the bundled software model was the company's real point of difference. And that friction slowed exactly the kind of fast, unified decision-making a company in crisis most needs. It arrived, too, at the worst possible moment for a cash cushion. Earlier that same year, with a receptive market for new stock offerings wide open, Osborne Computer had been preparing to go public, a step that would have handed it a real capital reserve to absorb a rough quarter. That window closed before the offering happened. So when the executive's premature announcement hit and revenue evaporated, there was no fresh capital to draw on. Only a shrinking bank balance, a warehouse full of unsold inventory, and two executives who couldn't fully agree on what to do about any of it. Meanwhile, the broader market kept moving, delivering the final piece of the puzzle. In March 1983, in the middle of Osborne's collapse, Compaq Computer shipped its own fully IBM-compatible portable and closed its first year, having sold 53,000 units for $111 million in revenue, a record for a first-year American company. Between Kaypro and Compaq, the picture is complete. Portable computers were selling briskly in 1983 on more than one operating system at more than one price point. Osborne had proven that people wanted a computer they could carry. It simply wasn't the company positioned to keep capturing the value of a market it had personally invented because its internal structure, its books, its inventory visibility, its chain of command, its capital reserves, had never caught up to the growth curve its own product had unleashed. The premature announcement was the spark. The tinder had been accumulating for the better part of 2 years. The collapse, once it started, moved fast. Days before the end, a hardware supplier sued the company for $4.5 million in unpaid bills. On September 13, 1983, Osborne Computer Corporation filed for Chapter 11, bankruptcy protection in federal court in Oakland, California, listing roughly $40 million in assets against $45 million in liabilities and more than 600 creditors. All but around 80 of the company's employees and a workforce that had numbered over 1,000 only months before were laid off immediately. Later that month, a group of investors filed a separate suit seeking $8.5 million in damages, alleging the company had concealed how dire its finances actually were. Within the bankruptcy proceedings, both Osborne and Jonick were eased out of their operating roles. By December 1983, a reorganization plan was filed that would replace Jonick with Ronald Brown, previously the head of the company's international division. Courts approved a reorganization strategy in April 1984, part of which was an attempt to build a genuinely IBM-compatible Osborne PC, the pivot the company hadn't managed to make in time to save itself. A cheaper Vixen model did reach stores in late 1984, and a scaled-back version of the company even attempted a relaunch in the United Kingdom at deeply reduced prices. None of it was enough. Osborne emerged from Chapter 11 in January 1985, but remained under bankruptcy court supervision, defaulted on a debt payment in early 1986, and when it couldn't raise $4 million in cash, its creditors liquidated the company on April 9, 1986. Not quite 3 years after the machine that started it all was still selling 10,000 units a month. What survived was bigger than the company. The Osborne Effect outlived Osborne Computer Corporation by decades, becoming permanent shorthand in business and product management circles for the danger of talking about tomorrow's product before you can ship it. The portable form factor Osborne popularized didn't disappear either. It kept evolving through the IBM-compatible luggables that replaced it and into the battery-powered laptops that would define the rest of the decade and beyond. Adam Osborne himself never really stopped inventing. He co-wrote a memoir of the collapse, Hypergrowth, with the journalist John C. Dvorak in 1984, then started over with paperback software, selling deeply discounted programs, including a $99 clone of Lotus 123 called VP Planner. Lotus sued in 1987 over the software's copied look and feel, a landmark case in software copyright law. Lotus won in 1990, and Osborne stepped down as the company's revenue collapsed. He tried once more in 1992, founding Noetic Software to work on neural networks and fuzzy logic. Artificial intelligence research, nearly 3 decades before it became the industry's obsession, before a degenerative brain disorder forced him into retirement. He returned to southern India, near the region where he'd spent part of his childhood, and died in the hill town of Kodaikanal on March 18, 2003, at the age of 64. A handful of Osborne 1 units, screens still intact, now sit in museum collections, including the Computer History Museum and the Science Museum Group in London. Heavy, small-screened, tethered relics of the moment. Someone first closed a briefcase around an entire office and called it portable, which is, in the end, the real lesson sitting inside that sewing machine case at the 1981 computer fair. Osborne didn't fail because he said too much about a future product. He failed because proving a market exists and building a company able to survive owning that market turned out to be two entirely different jobs, and nobody at Osborne Computer Corporation had built the second one in time. If this is the kind of history you come here for, subscribe, and the next relic will be waiting when you are.